Hi, my name is Juliet Burch. I am a short film programmer for Film Fest DC, and I am here today with Cheri Gaulke, John Gann, and Sara, Gama. And Cheri is the director of ALMA, Thomas, A Life in Color. John is the producer of that film. And Sara is the director of Miss CHELOVE. And welcome all of you, and thanks so much for making the time to be with us. So these are two films about artists that appear in Film Fest DC's 2022 Metro Shorts program, which is a program that shines a light on DC talent. And by way of brief introduction, Cheri was a pioneering performance artist in LA starting in the 70s, exploring issues of feminism and gender identity. She now uses film as a medium to tell stories of underrepresented people and groups. John is a longtime champion of short film in DC. He was the founder and was for many years the director of DC Short Film Festival. He's the author of 2 books about the inner workings of film festivals, and he's been directing and producing short films for a long time. It's great to have you here, John. We've known each other for a while.
Yep.
Sara is an American of Arab heritage. She had an international upbringing and settled in DC after high school. She got interested in filmmaking after appearing as an extra in a movie. She went on to attend American University's Film and Visual Media program. Welcome all of you. So I thought we'd start with John and Cheri, and if you could just tell us how you joined forces on Miss Alma Thomas.
Sure. So with a lockdown, I had nothing to do. So one of my friends who's an art collector knew of this exhibit that was coming to town, this Miss Alma Thomas exhibit, and knew the curators very well, and said, you know what you need? You need a movie to go along with the exhibition. Because my friend John has nothing to do and he needs something to do. So I got in contact with the curators and I'm like, yeah, I can make a documentary. I haven't produced a film in 20 years, but sure, I can do this. And I said, but I need to find the right director. So I went through my Rolodex of films I've seen in the past few years. And like you said, Juliet, I've been programming for other festivals for many, many years. And I remember seeing a film the year before from Cheri about another woman artist. And I just thought that the way she told that story was so unique and interesting. And it wasn't just talking heads, it was animation, there's all kinds of stuff rolled into it. So out of the blue, I sent her an email. I said, hey, do you want to direct a movie I'm going to produce?
And rarely does this happen that you just get asked to direct something. Usually I'm generating my own projects, and I had never heard of Alma Thomas, I'm embarrassed to say. John included the Wikipedia link and I clicked on it, and 5 minutes later I was madly in love with both Alma's artwork and her story and really wanted to sign on to do it. But we can talk more about what happened next.
It sounds like you have had this kind of thematic experience of artists of working with
I mean, I have a life of commitment to making women artists visible. And so this seemed like an incredible opportunity to help share her story.
Fantastic. And Sara, how did you meet Sita?
I actually know Sita because I know her sister. So the genesis of the film, it came out of a fellowship where I needed to find a woman, basically, of Muslim heritage, and but a story that hadn't been told before in the community. So I knew Sita's sister, Addie, who is a great sister, and she was always posting Sita's art to Facebook, social media. So it just literally, it was staring me in the face. It was like, I love Addie's sister's work. She fits the description of what I need, to try to, to tell the story for this fellowship. So I asked Addie, and I think, Sita is a very open, generous person. And we hadn't even met. We spoke once on the phone, and then I just showed up the first day of the mural installation, and that was it.
Fantastic. And so I, read about you all to learn a little bit about you, and you have some things in common with Sita, which I thought were interesting, about kind of your passed as young people. You were both DJs. You were both interested in the DC punk scene a bit. Can you talk a little bit about those common interests and, like, you know, did your paths cross then, or?
Absolutely. My paths crossed a lot with Sita's sister, Addie. Addie and I went to the same clubs. We had kind of DC in the 80s and 90s. It was, you know, the subculture era. So if you like techno, you might be in one club, but your friends might be down the street on U Street listening to goth music in another club, or maybe the mods were up the street in that club. But we were all passing each other on the sidewalk. So I'm convinced after I met Sita and heard about her story that we must have walked by each other on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Because the city is just too small a scene to have not met, but we were sort of peripheral to each other. But yeah, we do have similarities. I mean, the way I know Addie is because we were at the same nightclubs, and I wouldn't have known about Sita otherwise. So I really liked having that connection to her. I think it made, being half American and half Arab myself, and Sita being half American, half Indonesian, that was also another connection. So we did have a lot of overlapping identities, really.
Yeah.
That I felt made it, I mean, it helped me in terms of directing her story.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's really a very deep connection to have. That makes me want to kind of go right to the heart of a pretty deep question for all of you. So there's a moment in the Alma Thomas movie where she's asked, are you a Black artist? And she replies, no, I'm a painter. And I'd like to ask, how do you see your various identities reflected in your art, or do you see them? And let's start with Cheri on that question.
Yeah, you know, my career has been so much about, like I said, women artists and identifying as a feminist, really seeing my work as a vehicle for social change and social awareness. And also, I'm a lesbian artist. I wondered in the beginning, you know, she never married if she was a lesbian. I sort of hoped in a way I could uncover some, you know, new thing about her, which I never really did. I mean, John may have something to say about that, but you know, it bothered me a little bit at first that she wouldn't really identify as a Black artist or as a woman artist. But then I began to realize that she was a woman of her time, as we all are. We are people who live in the times we live in, and we do our best. It just wasn't important to her. I mean, and she did, part of her career was in a time of Black identity politics. And so there was a certain amount of pressure, but somehow she, you know, it was like she was an older woman when those things were happening. And I think people saw her as being of another generation where she would have felt uncomfortable making those identifications. But she certainly was a Black artist. She certainly was a woman artist. I think those things did impact the work that she did. But that's really her story to tell, not mine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John, how would you weigh in on that question?
Well, it's interesting. Early on in the making of the movie, I went to visit Alma's house on 15th Street. And I got into an Uber, and I mentioned to the driver that I was going to the Alma Thomas house, and she almost stopped the car short. And she goes, Miss Alma taught my mother or grandmother. And I was like, what? And I realized that there was this huge disconnect, that if you were African-American and from DC, you knew exactly who Alma Thomas was. And if you were white from DC, you really had no idea who she was, because she wasn't part of your community per se. She was a teacher for 36 years at Shaw. She was integral into the community. Cheri talks about how she didn't really identify necessarily as a Black painter or a woman painter. She was very much a connector. She made, with her work with the Barnett Aiden Gallery and everything else, she was very much about connecting people. And in fact, we were going to interview Sam Gilliam at one point, and we had set up this interview. He ended up canceling at the last minute, but he told me these fantastic stories about his friendship with Alma over the years. And one of the things he said was that Alma Thomas was the only person who he knew who could cross 16th Street, which from a Washington, D.C. point of view is a huge thing, that to be a Black woman in the 60s or 50s, 60s, and 70s who could easily go between white and Black Washington is such a huge thing, and something I really wanted to get on screen, but it's really difficult to sort of explain to audiences what that means if you're not from here.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
for me, I found it completely fascinating. And to me, it really summed up much about who she thought she was. She was obviously a woman of her time, and she felt that she was beyond these labels.
That's, yeah, I think it's a very, it's a very difficult concept in a way, but I think this notion of this is not the conversation I'm in. The conversation I'm in is color, and I don't mean color of your skin, but the color on the canvas.
Yeah.
And I found that deeply interesting, but I also, found the film was extremely, it was a story of someone who was recognized and appropriately liberated from, the inappropriate social bonds that we'd put on her. So Sara, would you like to weigh in on that question? How do you see your identity reflected in your art? And we can talk about, you could represent Sita there, because that's really integral to her story.
Yeah, I discovered early on that identity was really important to me. I know there's some people of mixed heritage or whatever your heritage is where it isn't something that they think about, but for me, it was a big piece of the puzzle for me growing up to sort of like fiddle with and figure out. And when Sita and I met and started talking, originally this was supposed to be a 2-minute short, by the way, but I after just spending one day with her and just starting to hear about her story and her identity, it's like, there's no way I can just try to communicate anything about Sita in 2 minutes. And I would have liked it to have been longer even, but just logistically, I had to cap it at what the time we spent together. So I found, like, speaking with Sita as well, that identity was crucial to all her art. Who she is who she speaks about in her art, whether she's highlighting, showing women wearing Indonesian jewelry or batik. She talks about that in a documentary, how she's always working in something from her heritage or her family history, and she takes stuff from the landscape. So that was something I really related to as well. As a creative person, and particularly as I became a filmmaker, I realized that that was not something I was going to shy away from ever. Whether I was writing fiction or whether I was doing a documentary, who the person's identity was, their background, their family, their heritage, the city they lived in, those were all part of their story. So that's natural for me to sort of peel those layers back, because I had to do it myself, right? And I find that's what I was asking Sita as well. And but it was part of her journey too, so it was a natural conversation between us, if that makes sense.
She said something that I just thought was really compelling, and I had to write it down. She talked about being young in the clubs and all of this, and being an ethnically ambiguous other person, and then later really grasping her Javanese heritage after a trip, back to see her relatives for the first time in Indonesia. And I wonder, did that experience speak to you as a young, does that describe something you relate to this in your own youth? Or is that just not applicable to you?
It's something I relate to, but Sita and I had some different experience. That's where we had some different experiences, because my mother actually was American, married an Arab, and moved from America to the Middle East to live. And Sita's mother came here to study on a Fulbright and married an American. So our parents did the opposite, really. So I have more connections to the Middle East, I think, than Sita does. Logistically, like I travel there once a year. For Sita, it was decades at a time, although I think she would like it to be much different. Mm-hmm. But definitely the feeling of being othered, of having to figure out who you are. And particularly for the both of us, we found that sort of freedom in the punk scenes. And for Sita, it became hip hop and techno. For me, I went into goth. It was very freeing. But definitely for the both of us, I think I can say for the both of us, our heritage was just who we are. And as we got older, I think society caught up with us. When we were younger, nobody really kind of talked about it or even cared about it, right? We didn't talk about somebody was of heritage this or half that. But I think society's catching up to it, and I'm really glad for it I think it makes the conversation richer about who somebody is.
Yeah, makes every moment of life richer, really.
We need.
Back to kind of art, the art. So both of these women go big with their art. Alma Thomas did 6-foot tall canvases, and then Sita is doing murals that are 2, 3, and 4 stories tall. Let's start with you, Sara. Just could you tell us what you think it means that these artists express themselves on such a large scale? What does that mean for Sita?
Almost like there's a thesis paper in this question, but I'll try to be succinct and to the point about it, because it is a great question. It's ironic because the mural that I filmed Sita creating is one of her smaller ones, but it was probably the most personal. If you watch the movie, you'll find out why. But I love it. I love that she can do any size. She can do a skateboard, and then she can do the exterior of the National Museum of Women in the Arts, which is an installation. She didn't paint the wall. But the hotel in DC that's like 4 stories, which has the guardians, the 2 women warriors. I mean, you can see that from so far away, and I just love it. I just think that to me is an artist creating a landscape in the city.
Yeah, and it's fearless.
Yeah, I mean the process of doing that too is so physical. Like that's one thing. If I could go back and refilm, I would try to capture, even on a small mural, how physical the work is that she's doing. It's more construction than anything else.
And this actually segues nicely back to Miss Alma Thomas. If John and Cheri, you could comment on this question of the size of her artwork. And then also, she had this like terrible arthritis late in life. So it too, even though she wasn't working on a 4-story building, it was an incredibly physical process. So would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think this is another way where she wasn't wanting to be, like a woman artist might be, too demure to do a painting that's very large. She wanted to be bold and sort of transcend and not be limited by gender. And another Sam Gilliam anecdote, Sam said that Alma said to him, "I want to make big paintings like you." And he claims she says, "I want you to teach me how to stretch those big canvases." And, and as we talk about in the film, it was at great physical pain for her with this arthritis to be able to do these tall paintings, and wedging herself between phone books to be able to sit upright and reach. It's really quite remarkable. And just a side anecdote is, we made this film during a pandemic, and I never saw an Alma Thomas painting in person until I went to the exhibition that this film was made for. I never met John till we showed in a film festival in Florida. I never met any of the people that curated the show or were interviewed for the film, because we did the whole thing remotely. But when I did, so I was working with her paintings as images on the screen and moving them around, and not really taking the time, I suppose I should have, to see like what were the dimensions. And when I finally saw the exhibition of her work, I was just stunned at how large they were. And how impressive, and how, this image behind me, you just kind of dive into and get lost in these just beautiful seas of color and paint stroke. They're just extraordinary.
Fantastic. John, do you have anything to add to that? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think that she painted at a time in which I don't think size was important to her. I mean, I know her last hurrah was the Red Azaleas triptych, which was the biggest painting she had ever done, and I think maybe that was her "I'm going out with a bang" type of thing. She knew that her career was ending, that she was getting too old to physically paint anymore, and so I think that's why she went that large. Because when you do see all the paintings together, they are all around the same size. There's none that are. She doesn't really do anything small. They're all, pretty big, what we would consider medium-sized paintings. And I think that's interesting that because that's her perspective. She sees the world through these relatively large windows. And I think that that's really interesting.
Thank you. I can't help, thinking about the commonality in these titles, Miss CHELOVE and Miss ALMA Thomas. Sara, can you talk about what that name means to Sita, and especially the Miss? I think of it as an honorific, and I think there's something to say there.
Yeah, Sita's name actually started out as Chel, C-H-E-L, and she came to that name because she liked the way the letters shaped together because she started out doing graffiti. So connecting the names together, the flow of the lines for C-H-E-L, she really loved that aesthetically. So that's the origin of Chel. And then later she added love for love because that's a spiritual aspect for her. And as she got older, she put the Miss there. And it's actually supposed to be spelled in bold, all caps, when it's in print, Miss CHELOVE. So I think what's interesting about Sita's graffiti name is that it's evolved from when she was young to when she got older to where she is now. And I think she was talking about tweaking her logo recently. So it's definitely a name that evolves. Like it's not a static name. And I think that's really cool.
And Cheri and John, there's a moment in Miss ALMA where she talks about choosing not to marry and being a miss. And I'm wondering, you could have called the film ALMA Thomas, A Life in Color, and you didn't. You called it Miss ALMA Thomas. So
yeah, and when we first started working on it, it had the working title of Everything is Beautiful because that's the name of the exhibition. But I felt that the film needed to distinguish itself from the exhibition, and I love that. Yeah, I am Miss ALMA Thomas. I am Miss for all the fools I missed. And this was a thing apparently she told her nephew all the time, that she was a single woman, and she was committed to her art, and she was going to devote all of her time, not to a husband, not to children, but to her art. But also I think it relates to her as a teacher. You know, she was so important. It was so important in her life that she taught for 35 years in the Washington, D.C. school district, and her students would have called her Miss ALMA Thomas. You know, there's a kind of formality of that. Again, that harkens back to her time and her class and her position in society.
Oh, and there's also this interesting juxtaposition between using Miss and, she became really famous when she was almost 80 years old.
Yes.
How many 80-year-olds do you really call Miss? So, I think the honorific, I think, works for her on so many different levels that it was important to put it as part of the title.
I wonder if there's anything you all have, any questions you have about each other's films? Putting you on the spot.
Well, I mean, there's so many artists, especially DC artists that, as we were producing this film, I was like, wow, I would love to make a film on Sam Gilliam. There's like 6 other DC artists I would love to make films about, because I realized so much of the visual art scene in DC is underrepresented on a national level. We have, I have dear friends who are very famous artists who are from DC, and they have a certain level, but they don't seem to get to that superstar level because they're here as opposed to being in New York or LA or somewhere else. And so I think that, I think Sara and I could, produce dozens of these
yes.
if we wanted to. There's so many incredible stories, and they're all so very different, but yet they all tie into what it is sort of to be from here. Because I think being from Washington is truly unique, especially like Sara and I, who are from here, like since kids. You really, it's a very different place. It's not a transient city at all for a lot of us who have very deep roots. And so it's, a lot of people don't seem to understand that, DC is more than a place to pass through every 4 years.
Yeah, for sure. And Sara, anything you would like to say about Miss ALMA, or also about being a Washington artist?
I agree with what John said. I mean, I'm, fleshing out 2 stories. Actually, one is a woman who lives in New York, but one is some local musicians I know. Because I too feel that DC is a very rich area, particularly musically, that is underrepresented nationally. But I think there's just something to say, not just about like DC arts, but just about, being a human in the modern era. And I think that through the DC lens, telling stories from the DMV, the region, I think that's what I want to do as well. Even if I do something fiction, it will be set here. That's really important to me too. And I love being from here because I had a good experience growing up here. And I think it was very international, right? So the fact that I could say that I was Arab American, people knew where my father was from on the map. People knew where Indonesia is, like where Sita's family is from. So I feel like there was a lot more understanding here. There's a lot more open-mindedness that I experienced that I'm really grateful for. It made me have a very happy teenage years and early adulthood. I do have a question about the ALMA Thomas doc I wanted to ask, because one of the differences, of course, between us is I directed something about a living artist, which has its challenges for sure. I think there are a lot of challenges about doing something about a revered artist, a revered person who has passed. How do you ask those challenging questions? Like I could work it out with Sita, but I wonder how you two, do you have to tackle any challenging questions, to get deeper into her story?
I think that we could have easily had made a feature. We had so much content, and we were spoiled in a way that we came to this project after the two curators had written a 500-page book about ALMA that was part of the exhibition. So we had access to all of her archives and articles and experts. And so almost any question we had was answered, in an immediate text message. So we were blessed with having all this information available to us. Cheri?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was challenging. And in terms of we really wanted her voice in the film. And the only recording of her voice was from this 1970s, what do you call those? Film strips that they used to play in classrooms, but they had music with it. And so you actually hear a bit of that film strip in the opening segment of the film, but we kind of knew what her voice sounded like. And I was hoping I could extract parts without the music, and I just couldn't. But we had all these quotes from her. So, we asked Alfre Woodard if she would be her voice. And so when Alfre first, recorded that, I was directing her, remotely, another remote. I just got chills because I just felt like I was actually hearing the voice of ALMA Thomas. I mean, she's such an incredible actor. So it feels, and I think most people think that ALMA is actually speaking in our film until the credit comes up and Alfre Woodard as the voice of ALMA Thomas. But yeah, these curators who've devoted so many years of their lives to her career and love her so deeply, they know her almost as if they knew her. I mean, it's amazing. They know the details of her life. They've looked at every little object. And we did have the one living relative, her nephew, who lived with her when he was a boy and is now whatever. But, he was such an important part of our film because he was the one person who could speak. He could say she had a well-stocked liquor cabinet, those kind of things that somebody who didn't literally hang out with her in her house, wouldn't be able to say.
I feel like there's so much more to say about these films, and you all three are so interesting in your perspectives, not only on these artists, but on yourselves and what this project has meant to you. I think we're just at the wrap-up point. Can you tell us where we can see Miss CHELOVE and artwork in DC? I know she's working on something really big right now. And then also where people can learn more about Miss ALMA Thomas.
So I'll direct everybody to Sita's website, misschelove.com, because that's the best way to keep up with what she's doing. And also her Instagram, because she's always taking commissions and always doing things. And I think actually you can do an audio. Yes, there is currently an audio walking tour you can download for her stuff, I think in the Shaw area.
Oh, neat.
On that, but go to her Instagram and her website, Miss CHELOVE, and you can even do a walking tour. But there's stuff in DC and is it Thomas Circle? Right now she's completing something at 7th and Rhode Island. There's an installation on the outside of the National Museum of Women in the Arts that's there through the summer.
which
I filmed
sounds
in lots of places.
fantastic. Yes, it's really worth seeing this installation on the outside of the museum. It looks just absolutely extraordinary. So thank you so much, Sara. And Cheri and John, how can people learn more about Miss Alma Thomas?
Sure. So this is the year of Alma Thomas. It's the 100th anniversary of her fine arts degree from Howard. So DC has lots and lots of resources for Miss Alma. I mean, the exhibit that was at the Phillips is now at the Frisk Museum in Nashville, and then it's going to Columbus, Georgia. But much of her artwork is still here in DC. The largest collection is owned by the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. Upstairs in the Luce Center is at least 3 paintings. The Phillips still has theirs. Museum of Women in the Arts, when they reopen in 2 years, they have an Alma. Most museums in DC are blessed to have a piece from Miss Alma Thomas. Our website at missalmathomas.com lists all the images that are in the film and links to where they are in their museums around the world. And we also have a bunch of other resources, including a link to a big repository of information that's currently on the Phillips website of other Alma Thomas activities throughout the year.
Fantastic. Thank you all for being with us. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it, and I know that our audience will enjoy it as well. Thank you, and thank you, audience, for joining us. Goodbye.